The January morning in New York City was unforgiving, a relentless assault of icy wind slicing through the streets and curling around the towering buildings like an invisible predator. Pedestrians moved in hurried strides, bundled in thick coats, scarves wrapped high against their cheeks, their breath forming white clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The honking of impatient drivers, the rhythmic hum of subway trains beneath the pavement, and the distant chatter of early risers created an urban symphony of motion. Yet amid the ceaseless flow of life, James Walker remained still, seated on a flattened piece of cardboard against the cold, unyielding wall of a closed storefront. His thin, tattered jacket did little to shield him from the brutal wind, and his hands, stiff and nearly numb, remained tucked deep within the folds of his sleeves. His fingers curled as if clinging to the last remnants of warmth. His breath came out in uneven wisps, his chest rising and falling with each shallow inhale, the cold making every movement feel like wading through thick, invisible water. People passed him without a glance, their eyes fixed forward, their minds occupied with work schedules, morning meetings, and the trivial concerns of a life James once knew all too well. He watched the well-dressed businessmen stride past, briefcases in hand, their polished shoes clicking on the pavement. And he remembered when he too had walked these streets with purpose, when he had somewhere to be and someone waiting for him. Now he was just another figure on the sidewalk, another shadow blending into the concrete, invisible in plain sight. A woman in high heels almost tripped over his outstretched legs, her face contorting in irritation as she veered away without a word. James muttered an apology out of habit, though she was already gone, swallowed by the sea of rushing bodies. His stomach ached with the sharp pangs of hunger, a dull, relentless gnawing that had become as familiar as the cold, yet he refused to ask for anything, refused to extend his hand or hold out a cup like so many others did. He still had his pride, though he often questioned if it was worth more than a warm meal. His fingers brushed against the military ID card clipped inside his jacket pocket, the last tangible proof of who he once was. A staff sergeant, a soldier, a man who had fought for his country. Now, he fought to be acknowledged, to be more than just another forgotten soul lost in the relentless current of the city. The wind howled through the towering buildings of New York, sending another sharp gust of cold air cutting through James Walker's thin jacket as he pulled it tighter around his frail frame. His joints ached from hours of sitting on the unforgiving concrete, but he remained still, watching the crowd blur past him. He had long since stopped expecting anyone to notice him, until a subtle shift in the energy of the street made him lift his head. The murmurs came first, rippling through the pedestrians like an invisible current. People turned their heads, their pace slowing ever so slightly as someone moved through the morning rush with an air of quiet authority. And then James saw him, Morgan Freeman. The man's familiar face, one he had seen countless times on movie screens and television, stood out even among the well-dressed businessmen and celebrities that sometimes passed through these streets. There was no mistaking him. The distinctive salt and pepper beard, the effortless grace in his step, and the deep, thoughtful expression that had made him a legend. Even now, wrapped in a long overcoat, his gloved hands tucked into his pockets, there was something about him that exuded both warmth and gravity. James straightened instinctively, an old habit from his military days kicking in as if standing at attention. His breath caught in his throat. He had spent months blending into the background, being ignored, being invisible. But now, here was a man who had always seemed larger than life, walking just feet away from him. For the first time in what felt like forever, James felt something stir inside him, not quite hope, but something close. Should he speak? Should he reach out? His pride clashed violently with his desperation. The words clawed at the back of his throat, but his body hesitated, muscles frozen not just from the cold, but from the weight of his own dignity. He could hear Sarah's voice in his mind, reminding him that pride was worth more than money. But then another voice, Michael's, cut through the doubt. If we can help but don't, what does that make us? His son had always seen people, really seen them, and now James had the distinct feeling that Morgan Freeman was the kind of man who saw people too. His fingers twitched, his lips parted slightly, and for the first time in months, he prepared himself to be noticed. But would he go through with it? Would he break his silence and ask for help, even if just for $1? The moment hung in the freezing air, poised on the edge of decision. James Walker clenched his fists inside the frayed sleeves of his jacket, his breath uneven as he wrestled with the decision clawing at his mind. The moment felt impossibly heavy, yet fleeting. Morgan Freeman was only a few steps away now, moving through the cold morning with an air of quiet purpose. If James hesitated too long, he would lose his chance, and the opportunity would slip away like so many others before it. His heart pounded, not just from the biting chill, but from the battle raging inside him. To ask for help meant surrendering the last vestiges of pride he had clung to since losing everything. But wasn't survival more important than pride? Wasn't this exactly what Michael had tried to teach him? Summoning every ounce of courage left in his weary body, James shifted his weight and pushed himself up from the cold pavement. His stiff knees cracked in protest, his muscles weak from long hours of stillness, but he forced himself to stand. The world swayed slightly. Whether from hunger or the gravity of what he was about to do, he wasn't sure. "Excuse me, sir," he croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse in the winter air. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The reaction was immediate. The two men flanking Morgan Freeman, the unmistakable posture of security professionals, tensed in perfect synchronization, their trained eyes snapping toward the source of the voice. One of them instinctively shifted his weight forward, a subtle but clear indication that he was ready to intercept if necessary. The other's hand hovered near his side, where James suspected a concealed weapon rested. James raised his hands slightly, palms outward, a universal gesture of harmless intent. But then Morgan Freeman stopped. The legendary actor turned, his deep-set eyes locking onto James with a gaze that was neither startled nor dismissive. There was no immediate judgment in them, no instinctual recoil. Instead, there was something else entirely, an acute awareness, a curiosity, and perhaps even recognition of the struggle written in the lines of James's weathered face. The street noise seemed to dull in the background as their eyes met. For the first time in months, James felt seen. Truly seen. His throat tightened. His body screamed for him to retreat, to sit back down, to disappear into the anonymity that had kept him safe from humiliation. But then, Michael's voice echoed in his mind once more. "If we can help, but don't, what does that make us?" With a steadying breath, James did something he had never done before. "Could you spare $1?" His voice barely rose above the wind, but it carried years of hardship, of loss, of swallowed pride. The world seemed to hold its breath. Morgan Freeman tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, thoughtful, perhaps even surprised, but most of all, he listened. Had a life that felt secure, a life where he woke up each morning with purpose and ended each day with the comforting warmth of his family. He had spent 22 years in the military, serving as a staff sergeant in the military police, a career that had instilled discipline, resilience, and an unwavering sense of duty. When he retired, he carried those same principles into civilian life, taking a job as a night security guard at an office building in downtown New York. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, the kind of job that allowed him to pay rent on a modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens, keep food on the table, and tuck away a little for the future. His shifts started at dusk and ended at dawn, but it never felt like a sacrifice because at the end of each long night, he would return home to the two people who made everything worthwhile, his wife Sarah and their son Michael. Sarah was the heart of their home, a woman whose laughter could brighten even the hardest days. She had been a teacher, passionate about shaping young minds, and her kindness extended far beyond the classroom. She had a way of making everyone feel valued, and no matter how exhausted James was after a shift, the moment he stepped through the door and saw her standing in the kitchen, coffee in hand, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. And then there was Michael, their boy, their pride, their reason for everything. Michael was sharp, inquisitive, and full of a quiet kindness that set him apart from most kids his age. He was the kind of boy who asked deep questions about the world, who saved his allowance to buy extra lunch for a classmate who couldn't afford it, and who always said, "Stay safe, Dad," before James left for work each evening. Their routine was simple but beautiful in its predictability. James would wake in the late afternoon, just in time to catch Michael working on his homework at the kitchen table while Sarah prepared dinner. They would eat together, talking about their days, laughing over inside jokes that had been built over years of love and familiarity. Then, after dinner, Michael would follow James to the door as he grabbed his coat and keys. "Stay safe, Dad," he'd say, and James would ruffle his hair, grinning. Always. Life wasn't extravagant, but it was full of love, of stability, of the kind of small joys that people often take for granted. On weekends, they'd go to the park, toss a football around, or spend the evening watching old movies, the three of them curled up on the couch under a shared blanket. James had never needed much to be happy. He had everything that mattered. A family that loved him, a steady paycheck, a sense of purpose. But all of that, every single piece of it, had been stripped away in what felt like the blink of an eye. James had once been a husband, a father, a provider. Now, he was just a man on the street, clinging to memories that felt like ghosts of a life that no longer belonged to him. The day James Walker lost his wife and son was the day his life split into a before and after. One moment, everything had been normal. Sarah had been running errands, Michael had been excited about his upcoming school project, and James had been preparing to leave for his night shift, never thinking it would be the last time he would see them. The knock on the door came at 9:42 p.m., a detail etched into his memory with painful precision. The officer on the other side had that familiar look, the one James himself had worn too many times during his years in the military, the look of someone about to deliver news that would shatter a world. The words barely registered. Drunk driver, intersection, impact on the driver's side, instant. A single moment had erased his entire future. He had thought he had known grief before, had lost brothers in arms, had stood at funerals, had learned how to say goodbye. But nothing prepared him for losing Sarah and Michael. Nothing prepared him for waking up in an empty apartment where laughter had once lived, for coming home to silence so loud it crushed him. At first, he tried to hold on. He kept going to work, convincing himself that routine was the answer. He told himself he was still a soldier, that he had survived worse, that he just had to push through. But grief isn't something you fight. It's something that seeps into your bones, weighing you down until even breathing feels like a battle. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped caring about anything outside the empty ache in his chest. The bills piled up, and, though his military pension helped, it wasn't enough to cover both the mounting medical costs from the heart problems that had begun creeping up and the rent that seemed to swallow more than it should. His body, once strong, started betraying him. Dizzy spells, shortness of breath, the kind of fatigue that settled deep in his muscles. The doctors told him stress was making it worse, that he needed rest, that he needed treatment. But how do you rest when every time you close your eyes, you see the faces of the people you failed to protect? He held on for as long as he could, but then came the night he collapsed at work, clutching his chest, gasping for air as the world spun around him. The paramedics said it wasn't a heart attack, just exhaustion, malnutrition, stress pushing his body to its limits. But that didn't matter to his employer. He was a liability now, and liability didn't belong in security work. They let him go with a handshake and a half-hearted, "Take care of yourself." He tried to find another job, but nobody wanted to hire a man pushing 60 with a heart condition. Within months, he had burned through what little savings he had left, and eviction became inevitable. He had no family to turn to, no friends left who hadn't drifted away in the wake of his grief. The day he walked out of his apartment for the last time, with nothing but a backpack and his military ID, he told himself it was temporary. Just a rough patch, just until he figured things out. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into something that felt permanent. He had once been a husband, a father, a protector. Now he was just another forgotten man on the street, lost in a city that never stopped moving, even when your entire world had come to a standstill. Even after months of living on the street, James Walker refused to see himself as a beggar. His circumstances had changed, but he was still a man of principle, still a soldier in his heart, still the father who had once taught his son about dignity and self-respect. He never extended his hand for money, never held a sign, never called out to strangers for spare change. It wasn't that he didn't need help, God knew he did, But asking outright felt like surrendering the last piece of himself that still belonged to the man he used to be. He had spent years teaching Michael that a person's pride wasn't about wealth or success, but about how they carried themselves in the face of hardship. A good man stands tall no matter the weight on his shoulders, he had told his son once, when Michael was just a boy struggling with the sting of his first real failure, and he never lets the world decide his worth. Now, those words echoed in his own mind as he sat on the cold pavement, watching as people hurried past him without a second glance. He found ways to survive without asking. He would wake before dawn and clean up the small space where he sat, ensuring he never left trash or let his surroundings become an eyesore. He offered directions to lost tourists, helped elderly pedestrians carry their bags up subway stairs, even watched over a vendor's cart when the man had to step away. He never asked for a reward, but sometimes people would leave him a few coins in quiet acknowledgement of his efforts. It wasn't charity, it was an exchange, a small gesture of respect, and that made all the difference. Pride didn't fill his stomach, but it kept him human. Even when the hunger gnawed at him, even when the cold pressed deep into his bones, he told himself he could endure it. He had survived worse. And yet, despite everything, despite the exhaustion, the loneliness, the weight of grief pressing down on him, he still tried to hold on to the lessons he had passed down to Michael. He had raised his son to believe in kindness, in helping others, even when no one was watching. Michael had once given his lunch money to a homeless woman outside a grocery store, telling his father, "If we can help but don't, what does that make us?" James had been so proud of him then, so sure that he was raising a good man. But now, sitting on the street, invisible to the world, he wondered if Michael would still be proud of him. Would he understand why his father refused to ask for help, why he chose hunger over the humiliation of begging? Or would he remind James of his own words, that a good man stands tall, but sometimes standing tall means knowing when to accept a helping hand? The battle waged inside James Walker was unlike any he had faced in his 22 years of military service. It wasn't fought with weapons or strategy, but with pride, memory, and the sharp, unrelenting ache of hunger. He stood on the freezing sidewalk, his breath coming in short, visible bursts, his body trembling from both cold and indecision. Every fiber of his being resisted the idea of asking for help. It wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about the promise he had made to Sarah so many years ago. He could still hear her voice, clear as if she were standing beside him, whispering the words she had told him in their last conversation before the accident. "No matter what happens, James, keep your dignity. Promise." Even when life had stripped him of everything, even when he had lost the home they had built together, even when he had been forced to sleep under awnings and in subway stations, he had clung to that promise as if it were the last thing tethering him to who he used to be. But survival had a way of eroding principles, wearing them down like the wind shaping stone. His stomach cramped with hunger, his limbs ached from the relentless cold, and the world around him had stopped seeing him as a man. Pride had kept him silent for months, but it hadn't fed him. It hadn't kept him warm. He had never thought himself weak, but standing there, debating whether to open his mouth and ask a stranger for a single dollar, he felt like a man on the verge of breaking. He thought of Michael, of his son's unwavering sense of kindness, of how he had once given away his own money to help someone in need without hesitation. "If we can help, but don't, what does that make us?" Michael had said. But what about those who needed help? Was asking for kindness a weakness? Had his own stubbornness turned him into the kind of man who would rather suffer than admit he needed another human being? The wind cut through his thin jacket like a blade, forcing a shiver that ran deep into his bones. His knees wobbled beneath him. He didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. Maybe asking for a dollar wasn't just about money. Maybe it was about something bigger. Maybe it was about allowing himself to be seen again, to believe that people could still care. His breath hitched, his heart pounded, and he forced himself to take a step forward. It was the hardest thing he had done in years. He lifted his eyes to Morgan Freeman, and for the first time in a long, long time, he let go of his fear. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice rough and uncertain. "Could you spare a dollar?" James Walker felt the stiffness in his joints as he pushed himself up from the cold pavement, his body protesting against the sudden movement after hours of stillness. His knees cracked, his legs wobbled beneath him, and for a brief second the world tilted. He wasn't sure if it was the hunger, the cold, or the sheer weight of what he was about to do, but his heart pounded so hard that he thought it might give out right there on the sidewalk. His breath was uneven, visible in the icy air, and his fingers trembled as he clenched them inside his sleeves, trying to steady himself. He had spent so long resisting this moment, refusing to be just another man on the street begging for help, but something had changed. He had changed. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat almost suffocating, and forced his voice to work, though it came out rough and barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, sir," he managed, his voice hoarse from disuse, from the cold, from the sheer weight of his pride pressing down on him. The reaction was immediate. The security detail flanking Morgan Freeman tensed, their instincts kicking in before their minds even processed the situation. One of them shifted forward, his hand subtly moving toward his side, undoubtedly where a weapon was concealed beneath his thick coat. The other took a half step in front of Freeman, positioning himself between his charge and James as if he were a threat. The movement was sharp, practiced. James recognized it well, having once been trained in the same protective protocols. He could see the silent exchange in their eyes, the assessment, the calculation, the question of whether they needed to intervene. It was the same look he had once given people when he had worked security, and now, for the first time in his life, he was on the receiving end of it. He lifted his hand slightly in a universal gesture of harmless intent, his fingers trembling from something far deeper than just the cold. But amid the tension, Morgan Freeman did not move away. He did not recoil, did not wave off his security, did not brush past James as so many others had. Instead, he turned, meeting James's gaze with a steady, measured look, his dark eyes filled with something James couldn't quite name. There was no alarm, no disgust, no irritation, just quiet curiosity. The kind of gaze that saw beyond the surface, that searched for something deeper. James's breath hitched. He had prepared himself for rejection, for being dismissed, for feeling invisible once again. But in that moment, standing face to face with a man the world revered, James Walker felt something he hadn't in a long, long time. He felt seen. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to finish what he had started. "Could you spare $1?" The words felt heavy, foreign in his mouth, carrying years of silent suffering. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Freeman's response. Morgan Freeman halted mid-step, the quiet authority he carried seeming to still the space around him. The city moved on, cars honked, people murmured, but in that moment it felt as if time had narrowed to just the two of them. His eyes, deep and perceptive, studied James Walker, taking in every exhausted line on his face, the worn-down weight of a man who had carried more than his fair share of burdens. There was no rush in the way Freeman regarded him, no dismissal, no impatience. He simply looked, truly looked, at the man before him, a rare gift in a world where most people avoided eye contact with those who had fallen through society's cracks. James swallowed hard, fighting the urge to step back, to retreat into the safety of his own silence. He had spent months learning how to disappear, how to be invisible to the world, yet now, under the weight of Freeman's gaze, he felt undeniably seen. And then Freeman's eyes dropped slightly, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as they landed on the small, worn piece of plastic clipped to James's frayed jacket, his military ID card. A reminder of the man he had once been. The name Staff Sergeant James Walker was still legible despite the scuffs, the edges bent from years of being handled. Freeman's brow furrowed, and for a long moment he said nothing. But James could see something move behind his eyes. Understanding, recognition, perhaps even a quiet kind of respect. He had played soldiers in films, had narrated war documentaries. But now he was standing before the real thing, a man who had once served his country, now reduced to asking for a single dollar. There was no pity in Freeman's face, no trace of the kind of look James despised, the one people gave when they felt sorry for you but didn't really see you. Instead, there was something steadier, something almost reverent, as if in that moment, Freeman wasn't just seeing a homeless man on a street corner, he was seeing the years before, the life that had led here. The weight of sacrifice etched into the lines of James's face. The security guards exchanged glances, still on alert, but Freeman ignored them. Instead, he did something James hadn't expected. He took a small step closer, his towering presence blocking some of the wind. "Sergeant Walker," Freeman said, his voice as rich and steady as ever, but with something softer woven beneath it. He wasn't just acknowledging James, he was addressing him with the respect due to a soldier. James's throat tightened at the sound of his name spoken with dignity, as if for the first time in years, he was more than just another forgotten man on the street. And in that moment, he realized that Freeman wasn't just listening to the words he had spoken. He was listening to everything he hadn't said. Morgan Freeman studied the man before him, his sharp, knowing eyes taking in every detail, the way his hands trembled slightly, not just from the cold but from something deeper, something that had settled into his bones over years of hardship. The way he stood, despite everything, with an almost imperceptible trace of military discipline still ingrained in his posture. The way his eyes, weary and sunken, held a quiet defiance. A man who had lost much, but not everything. Freeman had seen many people in need throughout his life, had encountered countless homeless individuals on the streets of New York, but there was something different about James Walker. This was not a man who had simply given up, nor was he someone accustomed to asking for anything. There was too much hesitation in the way he had spoken, too much weight behind those few words, "Could you spare $1?" as if uttering them had cost him a piece of himself. But it was the small, worn plastic card clipped to James's battered jacket that truly caught Freeman's attention. The military ID was faded, edges curling, but still intact, a reminder of a past life, of a man who had once served, who had once belonged to something greater. Freeman knew what it was before he even focused on the words, knew the significance of a soldier holding on to that badge of service, even when he had nothing else left. He had narrated documentaries about veterans, had spoken at charity events in support of those who had returned home, only to be forgotten by the very country they had fought for. But here, standing before him, was not just another statistic or a story in a film. This was reality, raw and unfiltered. He could see the hesitation in James's eyes, the silent war being fought behind them. This man had not wanted to ask for help. Freeman imagined how many times James had sat in that very spot, hunger gnawing at him, pride forcing him to endure it rather than extend his hand. The difference between James and so many others was that this moment, the act of speaking up, was not a habit. It was a breaking point, and Freeman recognized it for what it was. The security guards still stood tense beside him, their eyes scanning James for any potential threat, but Freeman knew there was none. This man was not dangerous. He was desperate, yes, but not in the way they feared. He was desperate not to be overlooked, not to be reduced to an invisible part of the city's backdrop. He had once been someone people acknowledged, respected, and now, for the first time in perhaps years, someone had truly stopped to see him. Freeman took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He had been asked for money 1,000 times before, had walked past countless hands outstretched toward him, but this was different. This was not just about $1. This was about dignity, about recognition, about answering a call for help before it was too late. "Sergeant Walker," he said, his voice steady, offering not just acknowledgement, but something deeper. Respect. And in that instant, James Walker was no longer just another nameless man on the street. He was a soldier, a survivor, a man who had once stood tall and, even now, despite everything, was still standing. Morgan Freeman's deep voice cut through the cold air, calm yet probing, carrying a weight that demanded reflection. He had heard the request, had seen the hesitation, had read the quiet desperation in James Walker's stance, but there was something more he needed to understand. His gaze remained steady, unwavering as he asked, "Why today and why me?" The question hung between them, heavy and unshakable. James felt his breath catch, his throat tightening, because he wasn't sure he knew the answer himself, not in a way that could be put into words. His mind scrambled for something simple, something that wouldn't betray the turmoil inside him, but he found himself trapped between pride and truth. Why today? Why now, after months of holding on, of refusing to break? Why had this morning been different from the others? Maybe it was the hunger that had finally gnawed away the last of his resolve, the cold that had settled so deep in his bones that he could no longer shake it. Maybe it was the realization that he was getting weaker, that each day without food, without warmth, was dragging him closer to something final, something irreversible. But it wasn't just that, it wasn't just survival. It was the way the world had stopped seeing him, the way he had become invisible, a ghost of the man he once was. Every morning he sat on that corner, watching life pass him by, watching people move through their days without so much as a glance in his direction. He had told himself it didn't matter, that he was strong enough to endure it. But today, something had cracked. Today, he had needed to be seen. And why Freeman? James let out a slow breath, his fingers curling into the sleeves of his tattered jacket. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't sat there waiting for a famous man to walk by hoping for a moment like this. But then, there he was. Morgan Freeman, a man James had admired for years, a voice that had narrated stories of history, of struggle, of triumph. And when James had looked up, when his gaze had met Freeman's through the shifting crowd, something inside him had shifted. He had seen something in Freeman's eyes that he hadn't seen in anyone else's for a long time. Not pity, not discomfort, just presence, a willingness to look, to listen. His voice felt like sandpaper as he finally spoke. "Because you stopped." The words were quieter than he intended, but they carried the weight of months, of years of silence. "Because I thought if anyone might listen, it would be you." He hated the way his voice trembled, hated how exposed he felt standing there, but there was no taking the words back now. He met Freeman's gaze, expecting judgment, maybe even discomfort, but all he saw was understanding. Freeman nodded slightly, not speaking yet, just letting the words settle. James swallowed hard. "And because you reminded me of my son," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He hadn't meant to say it, hadn't planned to bring Michael into this, but the truth had spilled out before he could stop it. He saw the slight shift in Freeman's expression, the way his brows knit together ever so slightly, in something that might have been recognition. James felt his chest tighten, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just a man surviving, he was a man seen. And for better or worse, there was no going back. James Walker hadn't meant to say it. The words had slipped out before he could stop them, hanging in the air between him and Morgan Freeman like a delicate thread, fragile yet unbreakable. His throat felt dry, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if trying to brace himself for the weight of his own confession. "Because you reminded me of my son." He hadn't said those words aloud in years, hadn't let himself even think them in this way, but now they were real, out in the open, and there was no taking them back. He exhaled shakily, bracing himself for whatever came next. For a brief moment, there was silence. Freeman's expression didn't change immediately, but something in his posture shifted, a quiet understanding settling into the lines of his face. He didn't look away, didn't glance at his security detail as if searching for an excuse to leave. He just stood there, grounded, his eyes locked on James's with an intensity that made James feel exposed, yet safe all at once. It wasn't pity. James had seen plenty of that in his time on the streets, the hollow looks of sympathy that carried no real weight. No, what Freeman gave him now was different. It was the look of someone who had truly heard him, someone who understood that this wasn't just about hunger or cold or even the dollar James had asked for. This was about something deeper. Freeman inhaled slowly, then took a small step closer, his voice even but gentle. "Tell me about him." The words were simple, but they carried an unexpected power, an invitation rather than an interrogation. James felt his chest tighten, the familiar ache of loss pressing against his ribs. He had spent years pushing it down, keeping it locked away, telling himself that remembering wouldn't change anything. But now, looking into the eyes of a man he had admired from a distance, a man who had stopped and listened when no one else had, he felt something shift inside him. His gaze dropped momentarily to the ground, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, more vulnerable than he had intended. "Michael," he said, barely above a whisper. He was 14 when his throat clenched and he had to pause, swallowing against the grief that still lived inside him like an old wound that refused to heal. He forced himself to continue. He was a good kid, kind, always looking out for others. He once gave his lunch money to a homeless woman outside a grocery store. James let out a short, breathless chuckle that held no humor. I asked him why, and he said, If we can help but don't, what does that make us? His voice cracked slightly at the memory, his fingers tightening around the worn edges of his military ID card as if it could anchor him. Freeman remained silent, letting the weight of the story settle. Then slowly he nodded. He sounds like he was a remarkable young man. There was no forced sentiment, no empty platitude, just truth. James felt something inside him unravel at those words, something he hadn't even realized he'd been holding on to. He had spent years carrying Michael's memory alone, afraid that speaking about him would make the pain worse. But now, standing here with Freeman listening, really listening, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a tribute. Freeman's voice softened. And today you decided to ask for help? Because of him? James exhaled, nodding slowly. Yeah, he admitted. I think I did. He glanced away, suddenly unsure of himself, but Freeman didn't let the moment pass unnoticed. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, not for money, but for something else entirely. Something James hadn't dared to hope for in a long, long time. Understanding. Morgan Freeman reached into his coat pocket with a measured, deliberate movement, retrieving his phone. The motion itself was nothing extraordinary, nothing out of place, and yet, to James Walker, it felt like the first shift in an unseen tide, a change in the rhythm of the moment that he hadn't anticipated. The crowd, already gathered in small clusters of curiosity, murmured with growing confusion. Phones were lifted, cameras rolling as people tried to capture whatever was unfolding, but Freeman paid them no mind. His fingers moved across the screen with practiced ease, and then he pressed the phone to his ear, his deep, steady voice breaking the cold air with quiet authority. Yes, I need to speak with someone in housing services, urgently. James swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anything, really. Perhaps $1, perhaps a kind word, or perhaps just another rejection, polite but dismissive like so many before. But not this. Not Morgan Freeman, standing in the middle of a busy New York sidewalk calling someone for him. His stomach clenched in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Shame warred with disbelief, gratitude tangled with unease. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. He had spent months, years, convincing himself that he could get through this alone, that asking for help, even in its smallest form, was already too much. And now, here was a man, a stranger yet not a stranger, undoing all of that in a single moment. The security guards, still positioned in protective formation around Freeman, exchanged wary glances, clearly uncertain about this unexpected development. They had likely prepared for 1,000 different scenarios, but their charge stopping in the middle of the street to personally intervene in a homeless man's life was probably not one of them. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably, muttering something into a small radio clipped to his coat, but Freeman ignored him entirely. His focus was on the call, on the conversation that James could only hear snippets of. A veteran, yes. No, not tomorrow, today. I'll cover it. No, that's not fast enough. James felt lightheaded, the weight of what was happening pressing down on him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He had spent so long being invisible that now, standing here in the center of all this attention, he wasn't sure how to exist in it. His fingers twitched, instinctively gripping the edges of his worn jacket, as if holding on to something tangible could ground him. This wasn't just someone tossing a few bills into a cup and walking away. This wasn't pity disguised as kindness. This was something else entirely, something real, something direct, something that had the potential to change everything. And that terrified him. Freeman's voice remained calm but firm, pushing, insisting. He wasn't just making a call, he was making something happen. And James, standing there in the cold, surrounded by strangers, felt an emotion rise in his chest that he had nearly forgotten how to name. Hope. Real, undeniable hope. And it scared him more than anything. Morgan Freeman's phone call was brief but firm, his voice carrying the weight of authority that made things move faster than they usually did in a bureaucratic system. He wasn't just asking, he was making sure something happened. James Walker stood frozen, still struggling to process what was unfolding in front of him. He wasn't sure if it was the cold, the hunger, or the sheer disbelief, but his legs felt unsteady beneath him. He had spent months being ignored, months learning not to expect anything from anyone, and now, within minutes of asking for a single dollar, his entire reality was shifting. Freeman finished his first call, his brow furrowing slightly as he dialed another number without hesitation. His deep, resonant voice remained calm but insistent. "Yes, this is Morgan Freeman. I need to arrange temporary housing for a veteran. Immediately. No, not in a few days. Tonight." There was a pause, a brief exchange, and then, "Yes, I understand. I'll cover any costs necessary. Just make it happen." He nodded slightly to himself as if confirming something, and then turned to one of his security personnel, who had been watching the exchange with quiet astonishment. "Get in touch with my assistant. Have them confirm everything and send the details to me." The guard nodded briskly, stepping away to make the arrangements. James could barely breathe. Temporary housing? That was something he had dreamed about, but had long since given up on. The waiting lists were endless, the system overwhelmed, and he had resigned himself to the bitter truth that nothing was going to change overnight. And yet, here was Morgan Freeman, standing in the middle of a freezing New York street, arranging it like it was the simplest thing in the world. James wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words felt trapped in his throat. He could only watch as Freeman moved on to his next task, as if this were a checklist of things that had simply needed to be done. The next call went to the VA hospital. Freeman's voice took on a slightly different tone, less commanding, but still firm. "I have a veteran here who needs immediate medical attention. His last checkup was months ago. He's been on the street and his condition is worsening. I need him seen tomorrow morning. Not in a week, not in a month. Tomorrow." Another pause. "Yes, I'll ensure transportation. Yes, I'll personally guarantee coverage if necessary. Just make sure he gets the care he needs." The way Freeman spoke, as if there were no possibility of refusal, made something tighten in James's chest. He wasn't used to anyone fighting for him. He wasn't used to mattering enough for someone to push through the red tape. And yet here was a man he had never met before today, refusing to let him slip through the cracks. As Freeman ended the call, he exhaled slowly before turning back to James. "There's one more thing," he said, tapping a message into his phone. "I made a call to a security agency I trust. They're looking for consultants. Former military, law enforcement, people with experience. You fit the bill. They want to meet you." James blinked, his mouth opening slightly in shock. "An interview?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Freeman nodded. "Tomorrow afternoon. Gives you time to get checked out, get some rest, and go in with your head held high." James felt something burn behind his eyes, but he refused to let the tears fall. He had woken up that morning with nothing, not even the strength to hope. And now, within the span of an hour, he had a place to sleep, a doctor's appointment, and a chance at work. He gripped the edges of his worn jacket, his fingers curling around the old military ID still clipped there. He had asked for a single dollar, but Freeman had given him something far more valuable, a second chance. Morgan Freeman stood for a moment, studying James Walker, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, the way the man's thin, tattered jacket barely offered protection against the brutal January wind, the way his fingers trembled slightly from the cold, the way he still stood with a quiet dignity despite everything. There was nothing showy about what Freeman did next. No grand proclamation, no unnecessary words, just a simple, deliberate action. He reached up, unbuttoned his heavy wool coat, and without hesitation shrugged it off his shoulders. The security guards tensed slightly, their training making them wary of any unpredictable movement, but Freeman ignored them. He held out the coat to James, his expression calm, as if offering warmth to another man on a freezing day was the most natural thing in the world. For a long moment, James simply stared at him, unable to move, unable to comprehend what was happening. Of all the things that had happened in the past half hour, Freeman's calls, the promise of a warm bed, the offer of medical care, this was what undid him. This was what reached past the layers of resilience he had built, past the shame, past the years of struggling alone. Not the housing, not the job opportunity, but this. A man, someone who had no reason to care, offering him something as personal as the coat off his own back. James's throat tightened, his breath unsteady. "Sir, I can't..." he started, but Freeman shook his head, his voice low and steady. Yes, you can. There was no room for argument, no room for pride. The coat, thick and lined, was still warm from Freeman's body, a stark contrast to the icy air that wrapped around them. James hesitated, fingers twitching at his sides, his mind racing with the weight of it all. It wasn't just a coat. It was respect. It was recognition. It was a gesture that said, I see you. You are not invisible. With trembling hands, James reached out, his fingers brushing against the fabric. It was heavier than he expected, substantial in a way that made him realize just how little he had to shield himself from the cold. He swallowed hard as he slid his arms into the sleeves, the warmth of it wrapping around him like something unfamiliar but deeply needed. The coat didn't quite fit. It was a little long in the arms, a little loose around the shoulders. But James, it was the first real warmth he had felt in longer than he could remember. Freeman gave him a small nod, satisfied, then casually adjusted the collar of his sweater as if he hadn't just given away the only barrier between himself and the winter chill. The wind howled down the street, but he didn't flinch. One of the security guards instinctively stepped forward, holding out another coat, presumably an extra from the car, but Freeman waved him off. I'll be fine, he said simply. James pulled the coat tighter around himself, feeling its weight, its significance. His voice, when he finally found it, was thick with emotion. Thank you. The words felt small compared to what had just happened, compared to what this meant. Freeman met his gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. You don't have to thank me, he said. Just promise me you'll stay warm. And for the first time in a long time, James felt like maybe, just maybe, he would. James sat in the back of the sleek black SUV, the leather seat seeming to envelop him in warmth. For the first time in months, he felt warm. The heat from the car's interior seeped into his chilled bones, soothing the ache in his joints and the weariness in his muscles. He had grown used to the cold, had learned to endure it, to push through the biting winds and the freezing temperatures that had become a constant companion in his life on the streets. But now, sitting in this quiet, cozy space, he felt a sense of relief he hadn't realized he was capable of feeling. His body relaxed against the seat, and for a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, letting the warmth seep through him, just letting go of the tension that had built up over the countless nights spent huddled in cardboard shelters. It was so strange, so unfamiliar, that it almost didn't feel real. As he tried to absorb the comfort of the car, his mind kept flickering back to where he had been just a few hours earlier. On the street, cold and invisible, asking for just $1 to survive, and now here he was, sitting in a luxury vehicle, a coat that wasn't his still draped over his shoulders. His heart still beat a little too fast, still unsure whether it was from the warmth or the overwhelming emotions that had come rushing in when Freeman had given him that coat. He wasn't used to being treated like this, to being seen as more than just a figure in the background of a busy city. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had just swept him up. Freeman sat across from him, his presence calm and steady, as if this was just another task he was completing, but James couldn't quite shake the confusion. Freeman's kindness, his willingness to help, was both a relief and a challenge to everything he had believed about his place in the world. I made a few calls, Freeman said, breaking the silence, his voice easy, measured. I've arranged a place for you to stay. It's temporary, but it'll give you a safe spot for now. James blinked, processing the words, but they didn't make sense. Temporary? Safe spot? He had never imagined hearing those words again, especially not after months of living from one cold corner to the next, from one uncertain day to the next. There's more, Freeman continued, his eyes focused on James now. I've also spoken to the folks at the VA hospital. They're expecting you tomorrow for a full checkup. It's about time someone looked after you. The words registered slowly, like a distant echo. A full checkup. He hadn't been to the doctor in so long, had stopped hoping for anything like that after the endless waiting lists and the frustration of the system. Freeman paused for a moment as if letting the information sink in, then added, and there's also an opening at Trump Tower. It's not much right now, but it's a start. They want to interview you tomorrow for a security consultant position. It's desk work, no heavy lifting, so your condition won't get in the way. You'll have a chance to get back on your feet." James could hardly breathe as the weight of Freeman's words settled on him. A job. A real job. The kind that people used to look for. The kind that used to be his life before everything had fallen apart. He wanted to say something, wanted to express his disbelief, but the words stuck in his throat. A part of him didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. But another part of him, the part that had long given up on anything better, felt the smallest spark of hope. He glanced at Freeman, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, James didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like he was just some forgotten man on the streets. Freeman had seen him, and more than that, Freeman was giving him a chance he hadn't dared to imagine. The reality of it all began to settle in, and James, for the first time in months, allowed himself to feel something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The SUV rolled to a smooth stop in front of a towering hotel, its modern glass facade reflecting the dull gray sky of New York City. The bustling city around them seemed so far removed from the quiet, intimate space inside the vehicle, where warmth, comfort, and a strange sense of calm had enveloped James Walker since he had gotten in. The silence between him and Morgan Freeman had become heavy with expectation, a silence punctuated only by the hum of the car's engine and the occasional soft rustle of clothing. For a moment, everything outside the car felt distant, unreal, as if the world beyond the windows belonged to someone else entirely. The driver's seat had come to a halt, and Freeman, still seated across from him, turned to face James with a look of quiet sincerity. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic pause, just a simple question that hung in the air, as if it had been waiting to be asked all along. "Are you ready?" Freeman's voice was steady and calm, but there was something else in it too, something that suggested he wasn't just asking if James was prepared for the immediate next step. No, this question was about something much bigger. It was about readiness, not just for a temporary room or a medical checkup, but for an entirely new chapter. James's heart skipped a beat at the question, the weight of it sinking deep into him. His hand, which had been resting in his lap, twitched slightly, and for a moment he was caught in a swirl of emotions: disbelief, confusion, fear, and something else, something that he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years: hope. The idea of hope was something that had long been buried beneath the layers of hardship, the crushing weight of survival. But now, as he sat in the back of this warm vehicle, staring at the imposing hotel in front of him, it felt like a distant yet possible reality. Was he ready? Ready for what? For a roof over his head? Yes, but that was only the surface. The real question was whether he was ready to fight for the life that had slipped away from him, to step out of the shadows and back into a world where he could be more than just a name on a waiting list or a face in a crowd. To take control of his destiny again, despite the years of struggle and loss that had left him feeling small and invisible. James took a slow breath, his chest tightening with the enormity of the moment. This wasn't just about a room for the night or medical care. It was about a chance to change everything. The past few months had felt like a slow, suffocating descent into hopelessness. But now, in this one moment, with Freeman's question echoing in his mind, he understood something fundamental. This was his chance to rebuild, his chance to be seen, to be valued again, his chance to start over. Slowly, his hands, which had been frozen with doubt and fear, steadied themselves. He could feel the tremble in his fingers, not from the cold, but from the realization that everything could change right here, right now, if he was brave enough to take that first step. He met Freeman's gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't look away. "Yes," James said quietly, his voice stronger than he had expected, filled with an unexpected determination. "I'm ready." In that moment, something in him shifted. This wasn't just an opportunity for a bed or a job. It was the first real step toward a future he had all but given up on. And as Freeman nodded in acknowledgement, James realized that the real journey was just beginning. James Walker stood at the door of the hotel room, his hand resting on the cool, polished brass handle. It was a surreal moment, almost too surreal to grasp. After months of sleeping on cold sidewalks and alleyways, on park benches, he was about to step into a space that he could call his own. at least for a little while. The door swung open smoothly, revealing a well-lit room that felt like a world away from the harsh streets he had known. The soft lighting, the warm carpet underfoot, the clean, crisp linens on the bed. It all felt so foreign, so extravagant in its simplicity. He stood there for a moment, letting the enormity of it all wash over him. The room smelled of fresh linens, a subtle hint of lavender, and the faint aroma of luxury that he had only ever dreamed of. He had walked past places like this before, seen the polished floors and the shining lobbies, but never imagined he would find himself here, standing in a room like this, treated with dignity and care. The weight of the past few days, the kindness of Freeman, the sudden shift in his life settled heavily in his chest. And for the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to feel something that had been absent for far too long. Relief. He stepped inside, his shoes clicking softly on the tile, and closed the door behind him. The small, quiet space was a sanctuary in a city that had always felt indifferent to him. He sank onto the bed, running his fingers along the soft comforter, feeling its texture beneath his rough hands. It was hard to believe that he was here, in this moment, that this life could be his now if he was willing to claim it. After a few moments of quiet reflection, he forced himself to move again. He had a lot to do today. Too much, in fact, for him to sit idly and dwell on the overwhelming kindness he'd received. He needed to prepare for the interview Freeman had arranged, a job interview that felt both terrifying and exciting. He rifled through the small bag of clothing he had left, finding a suit jacket that still bore the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke from the last time he'd worn it, years ago, before everything fell apart. He ran his hands over it, trying to smooth out the wrinkles as best as he could, his fingers trembling slightly. He wasn't sure if it was the nerves, the anticipation, or the pure disbelief that he had come this far. Once dressed, he looked at himself in the mirror, surprised to see a man he almost didn't recognize. The man in the mirror wasn't the ragged figure who had begged on the streets for spare change. He wasn't the broken man who had learned to hide in the shadows of the city. No, the man in the mirror was someone different, someone with the potential to move forward, to reclaim his dignity and his place in the world. He had a chance now, a real chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. The day moved on, and by the time he found himself sitting in the sterile, bright office of the VA hospital, waiting for his checkup, he felt a mixture of anxiety and hope gnawing at him. The doctors and nurses bustled around, their professional efficiency a far cry from the chaotic, impersonal atmosphere he had grown accustomed to in the past. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted to the past, the years he had spent fighting for survival, fighting to hold on to the memory of his family, fighting to keep the dignity that had meant everything to him. And now, for the first time in a long time, it felt like those fights were finally beginning to pay off. He had the chance to heal, physically and mentally, and to rebuild his life. The doctor called his name, and as James stood, he felt the weight of this moment press against him. This wasn't just about getting a roof over his head anymore. This was about moving forward. He was ready for the journey. James sat quietly in the small, temporary room, the soft hum of the city beyond the window barely reaching him. The morning had passed in a blur. Doctor's appointments, filling out paperwork, and the looming interview for the job Freeman had arranged. But as he stared out at the busy streets, watching the people rush by with their own lives unfolding, something inside him shifted. A realization hit him like a wave. He had been given a chance he never thought he would get. The warmth of the room, the opportunity to work, the medical care, and the roof over his head were all things he had once thought were far beyond his reach. But Morgan Freeman, a man he had never met before, had seen him, had recognized him as a person worthy of dignity and respect. Freeman hadn't just given him a coat or a place to stay. He had given him hope, the belief that he could rise again, that his past didn't define his future. James closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about the years he had spent alone, cold, invisible. He remembered the kindness Freeman had shown him, and for the first time in a long time, he understood what it meant to help someone without expecting anything in return. If I get the chance to stand on my feet again, James thought, his hand tightening around the military ID card that had been his only constant through the storm of his life, I will help others the way Freeman helped me. It was a simple thought, yet it filled him with a quiet determination. He realized that the kindness Freeman had shown him wasn't just about receiving help. It was about paying it forward, about making sure no one else felt as invisible as he had. He wasn't just going to rebuild his own life. He would make sure to lift others up when they needed it most. The story of James Walker and Morgan Freeman is a profound lesson in kindness, empathy, and how a small act can change the life of an individual. In this fast-paced and often indifferent world, we tend to overlook the people around us, especially those who have been forgotten by society. James, a homeless veteran, is proof that people who seem to have no place in society can still be seen and treated with dignity and respect if someone takes the time to stop and offer help. Freeman, with his compassion and sensitivity, did not see James as just a homeless man, but as a human being worthy of fair treatment. This story is not just about providing material help. It is about the powerful spiritual transformation that a simple act of kindness can bring. When Freeman gave James his coat, he didn't just offer warmth for the body. He offered respect, he gave a glimpse of hope, and he reminded James that he wasn't invisible. A small gesture like that can strike a chord with a person who has been living in the shadows, forgotten by the world. Freeman's kindness was a reminder to James that even in the most difficult circumstances, there are still people who care. A simple action like giving someone a coat may seem small, but for someone like James, who had lost everything, it was monumental. It helped him feel valued, reminded him of his worth, and most importantly, gave him back a sense of hope. This story also emphasizes the value of compassion and the willingness to help others. In life, we never truly know how our actions might impact others or how a single gesture can change someone's life forever. A simple question, a thoughtful act, can be the turning point for someone in need. The lesson here is that helping others doesn't always have to be grand or dramatic. Sometimes it's the simple, heartfelt gestures that make all the difference. Freeman's act wasn't about seeking recognition. It was about making someone feel seen, respected, and human again. Through this story, we also learn the importance of renewal and redemption. James didn't just get a place to stay or medical care. He got a second chance at life. Freeman's kindness helped him restore his dignity and reminded him that no matter what had happened in the past, he was worthy of a future. This is a lesson about kindness and helping others that we can all carry with us throughout life. The impact of such actions goes beyond just the person receiving help. It changes us as well, making us better people in a world that often feels full of challenges. The story of James Walker offers a powerful reflection on human dignity, the way individuals hold on to their self-respect even in the most challenging of circumstances, and the profound lesson that Freeman teaches us about truly seeing the forgotten members of society. James, a former soldier, found himself on the streets, destitute and invisible to most. Yet, despite losing everything he had once known, his family, his job, his home, he maintained a quiet pride. James never asked for handouts. He had learned early in life, especially from his wife, the importance of self-respect and dignity. These values were what kept him going, even when the world around him seemed indifferent and cold. Living on the streets, he could have easily succumbed to despair or beg for money, but his pride, rooted in the lessons he had passed on to his son, kept him from doing so. In the face of adversity, he never compromised on his values. His sense of dignity didn't come from material wealth or status. It came from his inner strength and his belief that one should never lose their self-respect, no matter the circumstances. Even when hunger gnawed at him and the cold winds battered his body, James refused to let his pride be undermined by the harsh reality of his situation. This quiet strength was what set him apart from others in similar circumstances, and it was something Freeman recognized immediately. Freeman, seeing James sitting on the cold sidewalk, didn't just see a homeless man. He saw a person with a past, with a story, and with the kind of pride that many had forgotten existed in a world so often obsessed with outward appearances. Freeman's ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize the inherent worth of James despite his situation, was a reminder of the deep, unspoken truth that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserves dignity and respect. Freeman's actions, offering help not out of pity but out of genuine recognition of James's humanity, speak volumes about the power of empathy. By seeing James for who he truly was, Freeman demonstrated that to help someone is not to look down on them, but to acknowledge their intrinsic worth. He didn't offer James assistance because he felt sorry for him. He offered help because he saw someone who deserved a second chance, someone with the potential to rise above his circumstances. This lesson on human dignity extends far beyond James's story. It speaks to a broader truth about how we as a society often overlook those who are marginalized, those who, for reasons beyond their control, find themselves forgotten and dismissed. Freeman taught us that we must not only look at the outward appearance of people, but, more importantly, see the humanity within them. Everyone, no matter their social status, their wealth, or their struggles, has inherent value. Freeman's quiet yet profound act of kindness towards James was not just about helping a man in need. It was about acknowledging him as a human being worthy of respect and care. In doing so, Freeman reminded us that our true measure as individuals and as a society lies in how we treat those who are most vulnerable, how we choose to see them, and how we choose to lift them up. The story of James Walker and Morgan Freeman quickly spread across social media, becoming a viral sensation that inspired countless people worldwide. The simple yet profound moment of Freeman offering his coat to James was captured in photographs and shared across various platforms, sparking conversations about human dignity, kindness, and the treatment of those less fortunate. What began as an act of compassion on a cold New York City street transformed into a powerful reminder of the importance of seeing others, not just for their outward appearance, but for their humanity. The story resonated with people from all walks of life, especially those who had never considered the struggles of the homeless or the hidden battles they fought daily. In a world that often prioritizes speed, success, and appearances, this act of kindness reminded everyone that there are moments when simply pausing and acknowledging another person can change their life. As the story gained momentum online, it sparked a wave of reflection about how society views and treats homeless individuals. People began to question their assumptions, realizing how easy it is to overlook those who are struggling, to treat them as invisible or unworthy of attention. Social media users shared their own stories of helping others, inspired by Freeman's example, and many pledged to be more mindful in their interactions with homeless individuals in their communities. The viral nature of the story also led to larger discussions about the structural issues that contribute to homelessness, such as lack of affordable housing, mental health struggles, and the inadequate support systems in place for veterans and others facing financial hardship. People didn't just see the kindness between Freeman and James as a heartwarming moment, they also began to think about the larger systemic changes needed to address homelessness in society. The story became more than just a viral moment. It became a catalyst for change, encouraging individuals to act with greater empathy and compassion toward those in need. It sparked a shift in perspective for many, urging them to reconsider their views on homelessness and to recognize that every person has a story, a past, and a future worth fighting for. The story between James Walker and Morgan Freeman carries a profound lesson about kindness, empathy, and the inherent value of human dignity. Through Freeman's small yet deeply meaningful act, we learn that every person deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their circumstances. James, though homeless and having lost everything, maintained his self-respect and never directly asked for money. This reflects an important value in life. Self-worth is something no one can take away, and it is not dependent on wealth or social status. From this story, we also realize that helping others is not just an act of charity. It is a way of nurturing humanity in society. Morgan Freeman didn't just help James in a material sense, but he also helped him regain faith in himself. This reminds us that sometimes small actions, such as a smile or a kind gesture, can bring hope and change someone's life. For those who have experienced life's ups and downs, like many older generations, the lesson here is the importance of maintaining kindness and respect for others, especially when they are struggling. The story of Freeman and James is not just about recognizing people in need, but also a reminder that we, no matter our age, can make a difference in someone else's life through kindness and sincere empathy. This story calls upon us to look beyond appearances and to offer help and support to those who might be forgotten or overlooked, reinforcing the idea that we all have the power to impact the lives of others in meaningful ways.